Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev Podcast. What if your organization didn't need a traditional hierarchy to thrive? Have you ever felt that endless meetings, layers of approval, and rigid structures are slowing your team down? Is self-management the key to unlocking innovation, agility, and trust in your workplace? These are questions we've wanted to explore for a long time on the OrgDev Podcast, but we were searching for the right person to help explore them. And that search ended when we met Paul Jansen. Paul has dedicated much of his career to helping organizations realize their full potential by unleashing the capabilities and intrinsic motivation of their people. He's created several employee-owned social enterprise and also non-executive director for 2 social enterprises as well. He's also the innovative of the brilliant podcast, the Work Punks podcast, with Colin Newland and Ben Simpson, where they give their refreshing and original views on how to deal with the challenges at work. And I've listened to every episode and it's really good. As you can imagine, Paul's extensive work experience is backed by a strong academic background with an executive MBA from INSEAD and an MSc in Industrial Engineering and Management Science from the University of Eindhoven. So welcome, Paul. We're so glad you could join us today.
We'll start with an easy one. So just tell us a bit about the work you're doing now and what that involves.
Yes, at the moment, I founded together with my former colleague from the Buurtzorg days, Tanja Eber, I founded TrustWorks, which is a small consultancy that helps organizations explore these concepts of autonomy, empowerment, basically bringing more trust in the workplace and empowering those great employees that you attract for a reason. So that's what we do. We provide consultancy, but we also provide programs because we believe that in a structured setup, it's sometimes useful to explore those concepts together in a sort of a little bit more classroom style and workshop style environment. And we do a lot of coaching as well. So we do team coaching as well as leadership coaching to help people through that process of adopting different ways of working.
Self-management, there's a lot written about it. There's lots of, LinkedIn posts about it and articles. Just tell us a bit more about what do you mean by that when you talk about the kind of self-managed organization? What does that look like?
So self-management really acknowledges that actually all people in an organization have the capability to make decisions. And where we traditionally in a more hierarchical command and control environment, we almost implicitly expect leaders and managers to make all the decisions for the workers, for the people on the front line. In a self-managing organization, a lot of that decision-making power is actually pushed as much as possible to the front line. So that means that in an extreme case, you may not even need any managers, you may not even need any hierarchy because people on the front line will essentially together make all the decisions and organize the work in a way that is required to address the demands from the market, whether that's clients or patients or anything like that.
And what do people get wrong about the concept? What are some of the myths that you see or the misunderstandings?
Well, there's a lot of... Is it myths? Is it fear? I'm not entirely sure, but a combination of the two perhaps is that self-management leads to chaos. Because if there's no manager to make decisions, then people will enter into never-ending conflicts. No work gets done because meetings are endless and there's always going to be debate of what to do next. And ultimately, the organization is going to be less effective rather than more effective. What we actually see in self-managing organizations is that they're much more conscious about these processes that are going on and much more challenge themselves to ask themselves the question, why does this decision need to be made by a single individual who's not immediately affected by the outcomes of these decisions, i.e. the manager sitting somewhere in an office, rather than the person on the front line who actually sees the effect of those decisions on a day-to-day basis. And that then really requires those organizations to find solutions to how to make that work. And that conscious effort to almost break down again the principles of how organizations work and then put them back together in a different way results in that very effective working together and making use of the collective intelligence that organizations have. I mean, we all are used to making important decisions in our day-to-day private lives. We decide to get married, we decide to move house, we decide to maybe have children, we decide to buy a car. All these big decisions that we make in our day-to-day life are actually not questions, but as soon as we enter the workplace, all of a sudden we leave that decision-making power at the door. That doesn't seem to make sense. So these self-managing organizations, they really try to muster
All of them. All of them.
You can tell I'm a foreigner, so sometimes I will be looking for words or still using the wrong words. Actually, I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. They try to bring together the collective brain power of their organizations and the collective passion and energy that all these colleagues and employees can bring to the fore.
So, Paul, and you touched on a really important there. It's like the misconception that it's chaos. There is actually a lot of governance that goes into self-management, isn't it? It's often, and it's just from our understanding, so we're really interested to hear what your philosophy is that it's just about that things need to happen in their place at the right time with the right people. How is the governance structured in many of these sort of self-managed organizations?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's important to realize, and certainly the philosophy that we come from is that there is no one-size-fits-all methodology that you follow if you want to become a self-managing organization. Although there are some philosophies out there that sort of provide you with a template and help you to get started in that sense, we believe it's much more useful to actually start almost from step one and really ask yourself some of the sticky big questions before you move into decisions about, okay, so how do we then practically run our organization? What should our processes look like? How should we meet? How should we make decisions? How do we do this? How do we do that? It does mean that you need to make some agreements with each other about various aspects of running your organization. So you need to make some decisions collectively about what behaviors you expect from each other, how you are going to make decisions, and how perhaps some of the delegating of decisions will work. Because ultimately in most organizations that have adopted some element of self-management, there are still some elements also of hierarchy. It's not that in all cases, all decision-making power is completely shifted to the front line. It's also about the processes. I wouldn't say they're governance elements. They're probably more useful tools and practices that help self-managing organizations to not descend into chaos and to encourage the behaviors that help those processes be effective. For instance, say there are methodologies out there, and some of them we adhere to, which is really about how do you conduct an effective meeting when there is no manager at the table who tells you, hammers through the decision or sets the agenda or what have you. So how do you create an agenda? How do you make decisions together in that meeting? How do you make sure that everybody gets heard who is sitting at that table, so that really you get into the habit of listening to each other and making sure that you indeed make the best of all the brain power that sits around the table, rather than just listening to the person who shouts loudest or has the most experience. So there are a lot of both practices that are useful to bring in when as an organization you're exploring this, and then there are some guidelines and principles that are helpful to set as an organization and decide upon before you embark on that journey.
And it's not necessarily big bang. It's not necessarily that you switch the whole organization over to self-management in one foul swoop. It's a much more subtle way than that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there are organizations who have done the big bang, and some have succeeded and some have failed. So you obviously can draw some lessons out of that. There is also a school of thought that says, well, actually, it may be, especially if you're an established organization that actually has a lot of explicit and implicit rules and behaviors that perhaps will no longer be useful in a more self-managed context, then actually it can be useful to start small and perhaps start with, I don't know, a couple of teams are really keen to try this out, or maybe engage in different style of conversations with some of your teams about actually what gets in your way in your day-to-day work, and how can we try to organize this differently so that we remove that hurdle, we remove that roadblock. And then with that confidence that you build by seeing that the impact of that, actually then take the next step. Okay, well, we succeeded in this. We succeeded in removing this roadblock. What can we do next? And what can we do next? And what can we do next? And then actually grow that experience and grow that confidence in working in that new way.
And I can imagine it also builds a track record within the organisation, because some people they may be well attached to their old traditional way of doing things, and this is quite an exotic. So they almost need to know that it works in this particular context before they get on board. Yeah,
that's right. And so therefore it's especially those cases that it's been done with a larger organization. Generally, they start small. They start with a couple of teams. They shield. We often talk about the heat shield. You establish almost a protective wall between the existing organization and this new fledgling organization. And once they begin to really hit their stride and begin to get comfortable in this new way of working, and others see the impact of that, that's when you begin to hit sort of the energy that's really latent in the organization. That's the time to begin to reduce the heat shield and that protective wall, and actually start bringing in those teams who perhaps may be knocking on the door saying, we hear all these great stories, can we start working in this way too? And then, then you get gold.
Yeah, that's the most powerful way, isn't it? They're coming to you rather than the other way around.
Are there particular functions, types of teams that are more inclined to take on board self-manage? Do you find like particular types of teams?
Well, I do find that there are two types of organizations, very, very bluntly spoken. One is where teams are more of an operational nature and are therefore quite similar in essence. And then there are other teams or other organizations where teams are much more of a temporary nature and perhaps are more, say, in software design or architecture. Teams basically, you could be a member of 5-6 different teams at the same time because each team has got a different purpose and a different duration. And these two organizations do tend to approach it in a slightly different way. I find operational organizations a bit easier to work with on self-management than the non-operational, for want of a better word. But apart from that, there is no sector I can think of where these principles haven't been successfully applied. We see it in the world of healthcare, we see it in the world of technology, we see it in the world of finance, aerospace, anywhere. So in that sense, yes, it can be applied everywhere.
I'm dying to ask this question because you've had such an interesting career. Looking back at your CV, you started out in traditional banking and had a huge role there. What was your journey into self-management? How did you sort of find it? And what were some of the big moments along the way where you started to think, yeah, this is a particular way of working that I really want to invest my career in?
Yeah, the banking part of my career, we shall quickly put aside. It was sort of the first half, which I don't regret, by the way, but I did have a mid-career point at which I thought, well, do I want to stay in banking or do I want to move into something else? And obviously the decision has been to move into something else. That was initially the world of social enterprise, organizations that are essentially run as businesses, commercially, win contracts or deliver services or sell products or services, but for a social good. Is pretty much the sector that I focused on after I abandoned banking. And what I learned from those initial few years of working in that sector was actually where those organizations were so successful, I thought, was that they were much more creative than the average company or the average government-run service in finding solutions to very sticky, very difficult problems. And often these are societal problems about, I don't know, rehabilitation of ex-prisoners, supporting people with disabilities, people with drug and alcohol abuse issues. Whatever the issues, these organizations tended to be much more forward-thinking and ultimately much more effective in tackling some of these problems. Not necessarily completely just eradicate them and solve them, but certainly be much more effective. And I felt that the key in those organizations to achieving that was that they really empower their front line to get on with it. And at the same time, having a very clear picture that they continuously enhance within the organization about what good looks like. So this is what we stand for, everybody. This is what we try to achieve here. This is how we do things in our organization. And with that clear sense of purpose, the front line was allowed to just get on with it. They were trusted to do the right thing. These organizations generally believed and believe that employees come in to do a good day's work and make a difference to someone's life. So that sort of once that sort of began to click with me, and a few years down the line in my career in the world of social enterprise, I then bumped into this organization called Buurtzorg, which is originally a Dutch community care provider, which has basically become really well known around the world for its self-managed team concept. They have about 900 teams of care professionals, mostly community nurses, district nurses, who deliver care in small teams of up to 12 people all over the country with great success. They do this without any hierarchy. There is one CEO, there is one director of support processes of the business operations. But other than that, there are no team leads, no middle managers, and no nothing. And as it happened, they do this very successfully, so they've got better clinical outcomes. Their clients, their patients love how they're being looked after and how they are supported. And their care professionals, their employees absolutely love this trust that they are being given, that they are professionals, that they've, trained to be a district nurse. So they are being trusted to apply all that knowledge and all that personal passion and creativity that they can bring to the job to do the best thing they can for their clients, for their patients. So the organization is hugely successful, not only for their employees and their patients, but also financially. They are much more effective financially, much cheaper than most other care organizations. So obviously that as a model attracted an awful lot of attention. And in the UK, as the NHS and also the world of social care is always looking for better ways of doing things, there was a huge interest also in the UK to see how Buurtzorg cracks this conundrum. So for a number of years, I worked with NHS trusts and with local authorities and other organizations. I helped them to understand the secret behind Buurtzorg's success, and we tried to run pilots to find out whether that way of working could also work in the UK, and if not, what sort of the importance of the context is. That obviously UK brings a different context in many aspects. So to what extent that context determines the applicability of how Buurtzorg works, or perhaps not.
So many questions to ask about this.
I've got for 52 now.
So if we go back to the kind of origin in the kind of the Dutch model, what is it from your perspective that makes that work? What is the secret to making it successful? In terms of patient outcomes, client outcome, customer satisfaction, the financial. What is the secret that makes it work there?
Well, first and foremost, there's not one secret.
I thought you were going to give us a silver bullet.
Yes, sorry about that. But there are a couple of silver bullets perhaps in combination. First and foremost, it is that clarity around what good looks like that the founders of Buurtzorg have completely infused the organization with, and they perhaps also benefited from the fact that they started from scratch. The founder Jos de Blok started with a couple of friends and colleagues back in 2006 or 7. Setting up Buurtzorg really with 1, 2, 3, 4 teams at the most, I think, with a very clear vision of what good looks like. For them, good looks like, or good care is about getting the patient as quickly as possible to regain or retain their independence. So this is not about time and task. So, okay, I've got 5 minutes to help this person to get up in the morning, 10 minutes to give him a shower, 5 minutes to give him breakfast, blah, blah, blah. No, this is about how can we get Mrs. Johnson to achieve what's important to her. So really build that relationship with the patient, with the client, as Buurtzorg calls them. Find out what really is important to her and work together to achieve that. And 99 times out of 100, that is all infused with regaining their independence. So that means that in the beginning, a Buurtzorg team would really try to work quite intensively with a client. That's about building that trusting relationship between client and care professional. And that's about really getting those building blocks in place that allow a Mrs. Johnson to regain her independence and continue to live an independent, healthy life as much as possible. So that principle of what good look like is really important. And then that trust that follows almost immediately after that in the capabilities of the care professionals to do the right thing is really essential in Buurtzorg as well. And of course, 99 or maybe 97%, I'm not going to argue over the number, but by the vast majority of our employees come in to do a good day's work every day. They're not out there to take it easy, to take the mickey out of the organization and have an easy life. No, they're there to make a difference. So with that philosophy, Buurtzorg really tried to put the things in place that help, therefore, their frontline professionals to deliver a great service as much as possible and take away all the things that distract from that. So take away the bureaucracy, take away the things that are time wasters, and let them get on with it and support them in that with what the things are that really matter. For instance, for a care professional on the front line, it's really important that the IT system that they use is really intuitive and really asks only for the stuff that really helps them in their work. So that they designed a bespoke system that really is very intuitive, very simple to use, makes the right suggestions that helps them deliver better care, connects them perhaps with colleagues, if colleagues could help them answer some questions that they might have. Don't require them to send in all sorts of reports or scroll through all sorts of different pages that are not relevant to them, or have to log on in 5 different systems to get their work done. And if their laptop, for whatever reason, is broken, they don't have to go for 3 different sign-offs to get a new one. No, they just contact IT, and the next day there's one waiting for them because it's been delivered by the speediest possible service, so that they can get on with continuing to deliver a great service. So all of these things, they've been made to be very easy, so that indeed they can deliver the best possible service to their client. And just to continue the opposite of that, whereas at the same time the center takes away a lot of the burden from the teams. So say if they decide, because the teams are also empowered to decide on their own office, which office they want to work from, or maybe this is a little shop on the high street, whatever they feel is the right sort of location for them in their local community. The team decides which it's going to be, but then the center will help them. Well, actually, we'll take care of all the paperwork and all the licenses that are required, and the utilities and all that sort of stuff, so that the team can just carry on with delivering the best possible service.
Sounds like a sea change in organisations, because obviously there's a lot of things that you're talking about there, but it's essentially a rebalancing of power within the organisation. Many organisations are managed through spreadsheets, and so I think one of your podcasts you were talking about Boeing and where it went wrong, where it started to sort of manage through spreadsheets and looking for efficiency. So for example, an organisation like Bertsaga, trap that it might fall into is on a spreadsheet. How do you increase financial performance? Then, well, you just reduce the amount of time between calls, or the amount of time spent with the patient or the client or the service user, and that then leads to more on the bottom line. But that's the balance where you're trying to trust people more, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And I think if you manage by spreadsheet, you live in a parallel world that doesn't acknowledge the complexities that are out there on the front line. So even if you are in a more traditional organization that perhaps works more in this fashion, and of course that ultimately is the majority of organizations out there, then I would recommend that you every so often tag along to a team that really operates on the shop floor, and just see how some of the decisions that you have made at a head office, how that affects people, on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes, those decisions are made. Well, let me correct myself. Most of the times, those suggestions and policies and decisions that are made at head office are made with the best intentions. But you only see this part of the world, and the world is generally more complex and more messy than that. So what Buurtzorg has actually done differently is completely acknowledging that by reversing how the power dynamics work. The front line is essentially the more powerful one, because they understand that that's where the information comes together that determines how care is delivered in the best possible way. And therefore, you should also give the power to make decisions to that part of the organization where that information lies.
And I guess you're really starting to touch on the organization's core beliefs as well, aren't you? As you were sort of saying, and you send them the laptop the next day, I can just hear them say, yeah, but what if? And if I do it for one, then I got to do it for everyone. And I think with any organisation, there will always be a certain number of people that may push things like sickness policy or procurement policy to its max. But we're having to think of the majority here, aren't we, in terms of how they sort of conduct themselves?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And of course, if out of your organisation of 10, 15,000 employees, 9,000 are ordering laptops for their neighbors and friends, then clearly you've got a problem. But organizations in reality don't work this way, do they? So there are a couple of, I often talk about alternative controls. So the traditional controls are, okay, someone needs a new laptop. Well, the manager needs to sign off on this and determine whether this is indeed the right course of action. And then someone in finance needs to check whether there is still budget for this, and blah, 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 blah. We go through all those hoops. And then once those hoops are all jumped through, then someone will ultimately send that laptop and it will be used. But the damage that is done in that process to the organization is significant, right? Ultimately, the person at the front line who doesn't have the laptop that she desperately needs can't really contribute to the organization. In the meantime, patients may even be harmed as a result of that. Wait lists may become longer, all these things that are happening. But also there's that level of distrust that you essentially, one of my former colleagues talked about organized distrust. A lot of these things are about, but what if things go wrong? What if someone is trying to fleece the organization, or what if? Whereas, and of course we can all think of rules and regulations and policies and procedures to try and minimize that risk. But the message that this sends to everybody is, well, you cannot be trusted to do the right thing. Whereas the benefit of actually sending the message that you can be trusted actually empowers and energizes 98% of your workforce that would never think of abusing the system as such. And then there are, of course, some clever things, like I said, alternative controls that help you in not having your organization spiral out of control. And one of those things is, for instance, the fact that teams are kept small. Self-managing teams, we always say, really keep them small so that you have the personal connections that make sure that, people don't take the mickey, but also if they do take the mickey, that the rest of the colleagues feel co-responsible for addressing that. You're collectively responsible as team for the success of your team. And therefore, if you see that one of your team members is not pulling his weight, or perhaps is raiding the office cupboard or whatever, then you feel the ownership and the responsibility to speak up about that and address it, because it doesn't go unknown. It's much easier to get away with that kind of behavior if you're on a large anonymous organization, right? And secondly, it also means that when these personal relations are there, and also with your clients, is that when your clients are unhappy about something, they feel more comfortable in addressing it with your team immediately, because you've built those relationships with your client and they know you personally. So if they know you personally, they might say, well, you've got this new colleague, right? He came to see me this morning, but he did some funny things. He did this, this, and this. Okay, well, you take it back to the rest of your team, and maybe you have a quiet conversation with that new colleague about, we're a bit uncomfortable about the things that apparently happened. I would have done it differently. What's your story? So that ownership and that visibility, I think, help in also as alternative controls to assure that the right sort of quality is being delivered, that image of what good looks like is perpetuated in the organization, and in the more extreme cases also that if money disappears or whatever, that things get addressed fairly quickly.
So you talked about bringing that model to the UK. How did that pan out? What were some of the kind of challenges?
So we discovered first and foremost that there is no massive difference between a Dutch care professional and a British care professional. And we also discovered that there weren't massive differences between Dutch patients and British patients. So the model, those aspects of the model actually can work equally well. If the organization is supporting the care professional in that way, then they will generally thrive. And if patients are engaged with, and if relationships are built with patients. I mean, was this case where a patient had been for more than 1 or 2 years been looked after very capably by the local district nurse, and it was ticking over nicely, and the patient was quite happy, to be honest. But once the Buurtzorg style team came as part of the pilot and engaged with this individual and started to really have these personal conversations about what's important to you and how can we help you achieve that, then ultimately, long story short, this patient could be discharged after 2 months, because all of a sudden things started to click into place, and that there was just a level up of care and effectiveness and outcome that could have been achieved. So we saw all of that good stuff and encouraging stuff quite quickly, but we also saw that, and this is no big surprise, that the gravity pool of the existing organization with its existing culture, its existing processes and procedures and habits was so strong that these positive pilots, and even the most successful pilots, ultimately got sucked back into the main organization. It was just a leap too far for most organizations to say, wow, this works, now let's do this at a bigger scale. The organizations couldn't bring themselves to take that step. There was too much fear, I guess, that would lead to undesirable outcomes. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I guess you're touching on it's the power of cultural patterns, isn't it, and how to break them. And even if you have different actors involved, people still follow familiar patterns, don't they? Even if it's illogical for what the organisation needs, those patterns remain. We just love that kind of consistency, don't we?
Yeah, I think so. And of course, a lot of these patterns are also, they're difficult to unlearn, first and foremost, especially when it's about behaviours and language and the softer sides of culture, I suppose. If you are a manager, for instance, who's come through the ranks, you're used to making decisions. You've been promoted because you're good at making decisions. You've been promoted because you're good at problem solving. So that's what gives you probably your motivation, your buzz. And all of a sudden, you're now being told, actually, we now want you to become more coaching style manager, and we want you to support your frontline team and let them make their own mistakes so that they can learn from that. And you're sort of thinking, well,
where's my status? Where's my ego going to go?
Well, exactly. That's really hard. And of course, it's not unlikely that you feel also a sense of lack of control, because you still feel responsible for the outcomes of your team, but you don't have the levers that you normally work with, and you still feel that you're going to be held accountable by your next level up for the outcomes of your team. So that's a really hard position to be in as a middle manager. So to make that transition is really, really hard. Secondly, I think a lot of the elements that underpin the beliefs on which the organization has been built are solidified in a lot of the processes and procedures and systems that we use. So if to come back to the laptop example, of course, nowadays ordering stuff goes all electronically. And there are all these decision trees, right, that have been and workflows that have been implemented in your computer systems. So even if the organization says, well, let's do things differently, let's have the frontline decide if they need a laptop, the computer system is still going to ask you for a sign-off somewhere, or you don't have the right level of authority, or you cannot see this piece of information because you're not of the level of, you don't have the authorization to access this. So if you do this properly, and especially in an established organization, you also have to look at those elements that send certain messages to your frontline.
One of the things I for many years was fighting against, because I just couldn't see it done well, and I've fallen back in love with it, is the whole idea of being very clear on purpose and vision and mission, and just the power of what that does. And you were sort of talking about one of the joys of working with a social enterprise is that often the purpose is really clear. You can actually see X effort equals Y outcome, so people's jobs feel significant and meaningful. That feels like an essential part of this, doesn't it? It's like the prize of what we're going through is so great that it is worth unlearning all these big things at a micro and macro level as well. What can organizations do that maybe don't have such a sexy purpose, that where it is about earning a shareholder's return, to create a purpose that is meaningful, that is going to carry an initiative like this through?
Yeah, it's a good question. Of course, not every product is sexy, or not every service is going to change the world. Having said that, every organization starts for a reason, right? They start either because they see a gap in the market and see that things can be done differently, better, more efficient, or whatever their reason is for jumping into that opportunity and solidifying that and really grabbing hold of that nugget, that really core kernel of what is the reason why your organization exists, is the one to really shine the spotlight on and really explore that, I think, and not just in the senior team, but also with other parts of the organization, to really bring that to life. And ideally, personally, I would steer away from grand statements, mission statements along the lines of, we want to be the choice provider of XYZ in Western Europe or something like that. I don't think that necessarily grabs people's attention. I think it's more about stories. I was talking the other day to the CEO of one of the organizations I'm a non-exec director of, which is a community dental provider. They provide dental services to people who otherwise don't have access to dental treatments, such as people with disabilities or people with extreme anxiety or children that need extensive dental work, etc. And she was telling me this story about, sometimes we get someone in a surgery who, or when she was a dentist and obviously hadn't risen to the level of CEO. And she said, who perhaps wouldn't quite tick all our criteria in terms of being eligible for a treatment. but clearly have suffered for God knows how long with these horrible dental situations. So I asked her, so what do you do then? Do you then send this person away, or and she said, no, we would still treat her. But obviously we would have a conversation afterwards also with the commissioner of the servers and the admin team, etc., of how to deal with these kinds of referrals. But the fact that she was so adamant that actually you treat the person, I think felt like for me like a great story of this is how we do things at Community Dental Services. We still see the person. We don't just see the referral or the so many broken teeth or whatever the situation was. So if you share those kinds of stories with your organization and explore them together, what are the kind of stories that really summarize what we're all about and how we do things here, then I think you begin to get onto something.
Because that's the kind of thing that guides decisions and actions in those kind of grey moments where we're not quite sure what the ethical and right thing to do is. And that has a profound impact, doesn't it, on the end user? And then that creates those stories again. One thing you talked about on one of your podcasts, and we'll put a link to your podcast in there because it is really good. You guys were talking about a particular situation where someone's feeling overwhelmed by reports. They're having to do them on the weekend, all this kind of stuff. And your co-facilitators were talking really positively about co-designing, sitting down with the end user and saying, do you really need this? And you were like, no, stop all non-statutory reporting because there's so much wastage in organisations. We always love to add things, but we never take things away. There is so much bureaucracy in organisations, and often there's a logic behind it initially or thought behind it. Bureaucracy is a huge friction and a tax on organisations, isn't it? Do we have to get as revolutionary as that to make changes sometimes?
Well, it works for some organisations. They're obviously the more extreme ones and the most courageous ones. But it is one way of really testing whether these reports and these processes are still adding value. And let's face it, every process, every report, it triggers also so much work, and all that work costs money, and it's time and energy and money spent on something internal that is not about external services helping your clients. So that should be a great motivator for organizations to be much more critical on their internal processes. And again, I appreciate that a lot of these processes have come about with the best will of the world and with the right intentions. But over time, they may have gone stale, or sometimes they just completely missed the spot. And that's hard to acknowledge when your career and your position perhaps depends on people complying with those kinds of things. But you have to, I think, be blunt as an organization. If you really want to raise your productivity, be really efficient, and make the biggest bang for your buck for your clients, then you have to be pretty sort of ruthless in keeping looking at that.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the things about self-management is this is not soft and fluffy stuff. This is very hard-edged stuff. There's some very, strict approaches to it. People are accountable, they're visible, and we challenge each other and we challenge our processes as well. I think sometimes that's the thing that's lost in translation, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so, because obviously it's not about anybody just doing whatever they feel like doing on that particular day. There are clear boundaries that are applicable in what people are there to do. It's just that within those boundaries, they have lots and lots of freedoms in order to deliver on those objectives. That I think is really important. And secondly, developing those skills and applying them internally within your teams about holding each other to account is also a really tough skill. There's nothing soft about it. It's really hard to say to your colleague why are you working in this way, or why you're leaving early, or things like that, when there is so much work to do. These are things that we really find difficult usually to address, and therefore helping teams, helping individuals, and helping organizations to adopt these kinds of behaviors of being quite candid, being in a safe space to say these obvious things is really essential. So we work with teams therefore on these kinds of elements, as well as these meeting practices and some of the decision-making practices that I referred to earlier. So how do you feel safe in a team to ask that stupid question? Or how do you feel safe in a team to challenge someone who says, oh, we should go left here, whereas you might be thinking, oh, everybody seems to be nodding along with this person, but I actually think we should be turning right. So, how do you feel safe in order to do that, and establishing that sort of nature and culture in the team? So, yeah, those are the sort of skills and elements that are absolutely crucial. And ultimately also being held to account. Even in a super flat organization like Buurtzorg, there will be every so often individuals and sometimes even a team or two who go rogue and feel that they can step outside of those boundaries that have been agreed and are not delivering on those boundaries that have been agreed and the targets that have been set, and are ignoring or rejecting all the support that they are being offered from the center to get things back on track. And then ultimately you have to also make a clear statement to the rest of the organization that actually that is not acceptable, and then tough action needs to be taken. And even that has happened in the past.
So if there's a leader of a team or, a chief exec of an organization who's listening to this and is feeling attracted by the idea of moving to kind of more of a self-managed approach, where would you suggest they start? What are the first steps that you'd get them to take?
Well, it's always good to read about those pioneer organizations that have gone before us and are doing this on a day-to-day basis. I think that's very inspirational. It also raises your confidence that ultimately there are different ways of organizing and leading in organizations. And there are some famous books out there. Good start is Reinventing Organizations by Frederic Laloux. You might want to read Maverick by Ricardo Semler, fantastically inspirational book, very funny as well. But there's plenty of others, and actually I in my blogs I also do quite a few book reviews, so you can always have a look there and see if anything takes your fancy. Then secondly, obviously I would suggest that they contact me and sign up for our Moving Towards Self-Management program. I say that obviously because I want to sell the program, but also we designed the program for those who want to explore this and want to get to grips with some of the concepts. And what we try to achieve in that program is especially getting across that there is no one size fits all. You ultimately have to find your own way through this world of self-management, and because the fact that you make your own choices gives you that ownership of making it work. It's not a coloring in by numbers kind of exercise, and it also provides you with some opportunities to anticipate the roadblocks that you're going to encounter. There will be, and we saw this in our pilots actually, there will be things that go wrong. Staff members, team members that perhaps don't quite embrace this or go rogue or whatever, or patients that, things will happen basically. And then how are you going to respond? Are you going to respond by retreating back in your more familiar behaviors? So I think we need more management, more supervision, more reports. Or are you going to hold the course and ask yourself the question, how can I support this group of people to get through this? And of course, that's much more easily done when you're thinking about this in a safe environment than when you're under a lot of operational pressure. So that's why we designed the program to sort of anticipate what's likely to happen when you embark on a journey like this and look at it from different angles. So both from the leader, from the middle manager, and from the team's perspective, so that you begin to get a fairly complete 3D impression on that. And then it's really about what we already touched upon, whether you think that this is something that you want to explore quite carefully and maybe start small and, just begin to work from the bottom up, or whether you're so passionate and think that this is a big bang kind of thing for you and your organization, or maybe you're a startup or an organization that's actually still forming and establishing its cultural traits and its structures, and maybe this is a good time to anticipate some of those patterns that we typically fall into when we are a growing organization, and actually already make some important principled decisions before you get to that point, so that you build in that new culture from day one rather than day 100.
So what do you do? What do you enjoy most about the work that you do, Paul?
I enjoy most when I see the penny dropping with people, and not just about understanding how some of the example organizations that we touch upon in our program or in our work with clients, how they make it work, but especially when I see the confidence grow and think, oh yeah, actually I think we can start here, and I can see how this benefit might actually be the result of that. And they actually you just see it. It's a bit like when people are walking around a house that they might be thinking of buying, and they start to talk about, oh yeah, I think our couch can go there and our picture can hang over. They just begin to make it their own thing already. And when that happens, I'm really chuffed. And of course, when people really start to embrace some of the process and tools and techniques that sometimes we introduce to them, and sometimes I'm really surprised how, for instance, one of the tools that we sometimes talk about effective meetings, because a meeting is ultimately one of the key tools on how teams make decisions, right? And one of the things we introduced to a team in the health and care sector, which was pulled together from all sorts of different parts of the system, we said, okay, well, let's put the agenda of your meetings together in a different way, and let's make and let's have you agree really specific time slots for each agenda item. I mean, it sounds too basic for words, right? And then let's have a process that if you see that you're running out of time on a particular item because you thought it was going to take 10 minutes and you're already talking about it for 15 and you actually haven't nearly finished yet, how are you going to deal with that in the meeting itself? So we practiced that a bit, and they took it away for their own practice. And then a month later, when we got together, one of them said, I introduced this to my colleagues, and it blew our minds how effective it made our meeting. And this was a lady who had been in a mid to senior management position for probably more than 30 years. And you sort of think, wow, when these simple things can make that massive difference in people's perception of how they do their work or effectiveness of their work, makes me happy. I would be even happier if I could turn upside down the way the NHS works, but ultimately that might be an ambition too far.
That's a whole other podcast episode, isn't it?
Just one key point on that is, what are the key capabilities that you think that need to be developed within an organization? Because it's one thing to sort of say, right, frontline people, you can now make decisions, but to a certain extent, there is a capability behind it, isn't there? So sometimes there are things where people have had sort of, maybe for better or worse, like learned helplessness, or they haven't had a chance to develop their practical judgment. So that kind of tacit, intuitive feel when they know what the right thing to do is. How is it confidence or capability that you need to develop for a team to start really flourishing, or is it a bit of both?
I think it's a bit of both, and we start with a bit of capability. So bringing a slightly different way of working. This meeting example is there for a reason. We help them conduct their meetings in a slightly different way. That creates a slightly different language, and that sort of sends a message, okay, we're doing things differently from now on. That helps them to listen to each other, to consider alternatives when they make a decision, and to really take ownership for whatever decision it is that they make. And we coach them in that. So it's really important that in the initial stages of this way of working, you support these teams, really give them the power, but support them in the process that they go through in order to do this so that they begin to build that confidence. So once the capability sees, or once they get comfortable with the process and get increasingly confident because actually the outcomes of the process are working for them, then they begin to hit their stride, and then of course the coaching element can be dramatically reduced.
Big question for you. What are some of the biggest lessons you've learned in your career today along this journey?
For me, when I started in my career as a junior project manager, probably, I thought this was all about A to Z of this is how you do change. And this is about somewhere in an ivory tower designing the best possible solution and then communicating and gaining buy-in. We all know the Kotter process, don't we? And then implementing it, and then everything will be hunky-dory. But of course, I learned that actually the world is much messier than that. So I'm now much more of the belief that effective change really only happens if it comes from within the organization and if it's bought into by the front line, especially if it's small and incremental, so that you actually, rather than have the big grand vision, you work with small incremental steps that you see the effect of much more quickly, and therefore builds the confidence that they can be indeed achieved, whatever it might be.
What do you do to invest in your own learning and development? What's that looking like for you at this stage in your career?
Well, I really enjoy speaking to people like yourself who are obviously operating in a slightly different part of the system. So I try to speak to many different people who are doing interesting stuff that I can learn from, or that opens my eyes, or maybe checks me back on maybe I'm getting a little bit too much out there and need to be reined back in, or hear what went wrong at certain places. So that's important learning for me. I love there's so many great blogs and books out there on this and related topics that I can probably read 24 hours a day and still don't get on top of it, but I do some of that. So yeah, those are my two most important sources of new information and learning.
Brilliant. And what's interesting you about the whole field at the moment? Is there anything that's kind of emerging at the moment that's like a new trend or like a classical principle that's coming back into vogue again? What is it that's about self-management that's interesting you at the moment?
Yeah, I'm curious about where AI will sit in this world. I think one of the, look at me, I'm 58 years old, so clearly I'm going to have to work hard to get my head around the potential of AI. But I'm doing my best. I'd like to think that the potential upsides of AI are that they can help us deal with the complex world out there. I think one of the great advantages of adopting some of the self-management principles is that it allows you to be much more responsive in this complex world that we operate in. Maybe AI is an additional tool in that will both help the top level in organizations, but also the front line in dealing with that. But whether it will or not, I don't know. But clearly, this is the topic in work land that I think will dominate the conversations for quite a while. Related to self-management is the whole return to office versus working from home debate. Of course, that's certainly been going on now for a few years, but seems to be swinging back into the return to office section. It will come as no surprise that I'm a firm believer of working with your frontline on solutions in this sense, really having adult mature conversations that are about what works for you. How can we help you deliver the best possible service for our clients, and then try and find a way that addresses priorities that live on both sides. So I think that discussion is not going to be finished yet, but I do think that, if it ever will, but I do think that self-management as a concept and the principles, the way we work, will be a great tool in helping address that debate.
Brilliant. And then last question from us. It's been a really fascinating discussion. One of the regional intentions behind this podcast was inspire the next generation of practitioners coming through. And obviously organization development is the umbrella term for the podcast, but self-management is a core part of that. What advice would you give someone who's just starting out in the field now?
That's a really difficult one, isn't it? I think the first and foremost, be open-minded. Try to absorb as much as possible different schools of thought in this field. Don't latch on to one of which you think chimes the most with your beliefs at this point in time, but try and stay open-minded about whatever else is going on. At the very least, it will help you better understand where other people and other organizations might be coming from and why they might be doing what they are doing or struggling in what they're doing. Like I said earlier, in answer to one of your questions, I certainly have moved from one end of the scale to another end of the scale, and I think it's given me more empathy for people in leadership and managerial positions as a result of that. If you want to know more about self-management and just want to spend 9 minutes on it, I would certainly suggest, and this doesn't just go for beginning OD practitioners, but this goes for everyone. I really loved the video by David Marquette called Greatness. He wrote a book called Turn the Ship Around. He was the captain or the commander, probably I should say, of a nuclear submarine, and he used self-management principles to really turn that ship around. It was a completely underperforming organization, and he made it within 6 months. He made it the top performing part of the American Navy, and that 9 minutes is a wonderful video. If you can find it on Google, look for Greatness, David Marquette with a Q-U-E-T is certainly worth it and might be of some inspiration.
Brilliant. Well, Paul, I want to say a huge thank you. This has been a really, engaging but grounded, hugely practical but inspiring conversation, and I hope it just does give people the confidence to, wherever you are in your journey, to start exploring the whole world of self-management. And it isn't what it is, and there's a lot of myths out there, but the more you know about it, the more you know that it can be done in different sizes in your organization. It's just a world of experiments that are ready to be done. Danny, what are you taking away from today's conversation?
I particularly enjoyed the kind of how you broke down what's made it work. So the idea that you being really clear on what good looks like, the importance of trust, and that whole piece around taking away the distractions and providing support so people can focus on the real work. I thought that was really powerful. I love the discussion about the kind of traditional controls versus alternative controls, almost that sense of the self-correcting mechanism in place if you get your things right. And then just the reminder of the power of systems and the constraints just to draw people back to status quo.
Yeah, absolutely. And ditto for all those things. I think just to build on any of Danny's, it's just the importance of psychological safety in all of this. Like if you're serious about leveraging the collective IQ of your people, because that's what we're really trying to do here, then you have to create the conditions where that is going to flourish. But that's hard, and that requires consistency and courage on the manager's part as well. So there's just so many takeaways in this. Paul, if people want to follow your work, you are prolific, you have a blog, you have a podcast, you're always out there. How can people follow your work or even connect with TrustWorks as well?
So obviously I'm on LinkedIn. Quite a few Paul Jansens out there. It's one of the most common names in the Netherlands, I'm afraid. The company is called TrustWorks. Trust-works.co.uk is our website, and you can find the blogs on there as well. Obviously, I'd love to hear from you out there if you're interested in having a conversation about what this might mean for you and your company. And finally, I really want to thank you for the invitation, Garen and Danny. It's been really enjoyable exploring this with you, and I love the conversation. So thanks again.
Brilliant. We've loved it. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Paul. Have a great time. And yeah, please do contact Paul. If you found this conversation useful and you think you know someone that would benefit from this conversation listening to it, then please do share the podcast with it as well. We get so many shares on each of the podcasts we put out. So reach out to somebody you think might be struggling as well. And also the algorithm gods, if you love it, if you like the podcast, whether you listen to it on audio or in video as well. But most importantly, thank you so much for your time, Paul. And thanks for just answering all of our questions with such depth and expertise as well. So thank you.
It's been a pleasure.